What if I told you the most decisive moment in a relationship wasn't the argument, the confrontation, or even the betrayal, but the instant someone quietly withdraws their emotional presence? Not out of anger, not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. Because when an empath reaches that moment, something irreversible takes place. And once it happens, there is no negotiation that can undo it. Stay with me, because what happens next will completely rewrite everything you thought you knew about emotional power. Carl Jung spent his life studying the human psyche, and one of his most unsettling observations was this: the mind does not collapse at its limits, it reorganizes. What looks like emotional shutdown from the outside is often a deep psychological transformation happening within, and nowhere is this more misunderstood than in people who care too deeply. Empaths are often mistaken for being endlessly resilient. Their patience is misread as capacity. Their forgiveness is assumed to be infinite. People take their emotional presence for granted, believing it will always be available, always accessible, always willing to absorb what others refuse to face. But Jung discovered that the psyche does not allow imbalance to continue forever. He called it psychological compensation. When a quality is overused, when it's stretched beyond what the self can sustain, it doesn't disappear, it reverses, it transforms into its opposite. The empath who has given too much, loved too hard, and endured too long eventually reaches this turning point. Jung referred to it as enantiodromia, the moment when an extreme flips into its counterforce, and when that flip happens, it doesn't happen slowly, it happens completely. Empaths live in a near-constant state of emotional labor. They sense emotional shifts before words are spoken. They feel tension in rooms before they enter them. They carry other people's pain, often without being asked, that if they can just understand it, they can heal it. But Jung was clear about this: no psyche can survive indefinite self-sacrifice. And when the empath reaches their threshold, it's not a breakdown, it's a correction. Here's the part most people get wrong. When an empath stops caring, they're not becoming cold, they're becoming integrated. They're finally reclaiming the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress. Jung called this the integration of the shadow. For empaths, the shadow isn't cruelty or malice, it's discernment. It's the ability to withdraw access. It's the realization that not everyone deserves intimacy, explanation, or emotional availability. It's the part that understands that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. According to Jung's theory of individuation, psychological maturity requires a moment of self-selection, a moment when the individual chooses alignment with themselves over loyalty to dysfunction. For most people this happens organically, but for empaths it feels wrong, almost immoral, because they've been conditioned to believe that prioritizing themselves is selfish. But Jung argued the opposite. He believed that abandoning oneself is one of the most destructive acts a person can commit against their own psyche. And when an empath finally stops doing that, something remarkable occurs. They don't lose their sensitivity, they gain structure. They don't lose compassion, they gain boundaries. This is where the dynamic in relationships begins to unravel, because many unhealthy dynamics depend on the empath's willingness to absorb discomfort. Guilt, hope, responsibility, these become tools, whether consciously or unconsciously used. The empath keeps trying, keeps explaining, keeps believing that if they just show enough patience, something will change. But when emotional detachment sets in, those tools stop working, the words no longer penetrate. The apologies sound repetitive. The promises feel familiar instead of reassuring. Jung described this state as psychological sovereignty, the moment a person's sense of self is no longer anchored to external validation or emotional reciprocity. From the outside it looks like indifference, but it's not apathy, it's clarity. The empath doesn't lash out. They don't argue, they don't seek closure. They simply see. They see patterns instead of potential, consistency instead of intention, reality instead of hope. Jung referred to this as radical acceptance, the ability to perceive what is rather than what could be without distortion. And once an empath reaches this point, the relationship doesn't end with conflict, it ends with absence. This is why people often describe awakened empaths as dangerous, not because they seek harm, but because they become unreachable. They stop explaining themselves, they stop defending their perceptions, they stop negotiating their worth, they don't punish, they withdraw. Jung believed that the most powerful position in any relationship is not control, but independence of psyche. When a person no longer needs to be chosen, understood, or validated in order to feel whole, that is psychological completion. And when an empath reaches that stage, they don't announce it, they don't dramatize it, they don't leave with a speech, they simply remove their energy. And in that quiet withdrawal, they rediscover something they lost long ago, themselves, before caring became suffering, before love became endurance, before being needed became the measure of worth. This is what truly happens when an empath stops caring, not collapse, transformation. Their empathy was never a weakness, it was a gift, and when that gift is no longer freely given, what remains is someone who finally understands where their emotional energy belongs, with themselves.